Hello, everyone. All right. Thank you for joining today's webinar brought to you by Payoneer. Payoneer is a cross-border payments platform empowering businesses to receive, pay, and grow with the rest of the world. Whether you are a freelancer just starting out or you're an agency thinking of expanding your business, getting more clients, and paying your team, we at Payoneer have a solution to your payment needs. My name is Patricia, and I'm from Payoneer Southeast Asia's Customer Success Team. Our webinar for today is entitled How to Register Your Company with BOI and PEZA. In this webinar, we'll be looking at your next step. For you, whether you're a freelancer or you're an agency, or basically just wanting to scale in this industry, what does it entail for you to register your business with these two government agencies? Why should you even consider it? What are the benefits? And what do you expect in the process? So today, I'm very happy and we are very lucky to be joined by our friends from Carpo Law and Associates. Without further ado, I would like to introduce them. With us is Attorney John Leveriza. He is a litigation and corporate lawyer who obtained his Juris Doctor degree from Ateneo de Manila University School of Law. And he became a member of the IBPAC in 2018. Today, he will be shedding some light into registering with BOI. Attorney John, hello, welcome.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting us.
So please tell us more. For those who really are very interested, we have Payoneer customers, they're really interested on how they could move forward with their business or putting up a business even. Is this process like registering with BOI? What is it all about? What could they expect out of it?
Yeah, well, hopefully I can discuss all of those points as we progress through the presentation. But as mentioned earlier, our team, meaning Attorney Danny and I, will be discussing the different requirements for registering with the two agencies, namely the Board of Investments and the Philippine Economic Zone Authority, and what are the specific considerations that your clients and the entrepreneurs here with us today would want to factor in deciding how they wish to expand and then take advantage of those incentives offered by these two agencies. So hopefully we get to address all of those concerns and then help them in arriving at that decision.
Yes, please, Attorney, enlighten us, please.
Okay, so again, good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting Carpo Law and Associates to this webinar. So for today's discussion, we'll be splitting it into two. I will be discussing the requirements on their Board of Investments, and my colleague here, Attorney Danny, will be touching on what considerations you must consider when registering with PEZA. So for BOI, these are the specific questions we wish to address, and the important reminders that you might want to take note of when you register with the BOI. So what is the BOI, or the Board of Investments? It's an attached agency of the Department of Trade and Industry, DTI. I'm sure all of you are familiar with DTI, but BOI in particular is the lead government agency responsible for the promotion of investments in the Philippines. Its mission, although this is just this is not the complete mission and vision of BOI, but I just wanted to emphasize that it's tasked with the developing globally competitive industries and generate local and foreign investments thus increasing employment. This is important to remember as we go along and progress through the slides, because I'll be circling back to that to show why they put so much premium in those activities. So some of the services offered by the Board of Investments is the application for registration under Book 1 of Executive Order 226, otherwise known as the Omnibus Investments Code of 1987. So this we will be elaborating and highlighting on, uh, as mentioned earlier. And for legal and compliance services, they also cater to the issuance of certificate of income tax holiday and entitlement, which of course we will aspire for and study as one of the main considerations for registering with the BOI. Issuance of certificate of qualification to import tax and duty-free spare parts and supplies, and certificate of registration once you complete the registration process. So for the incentives, as earlier mentioned, the primary incentive offered when you register with BOI is the income tax holiday. Here I must note and emphasize that when you register with the BOI, it's very specific to the type of activity. It's activity based, unlike as you will learn later on with PEZA, it's more on the location that that serves as the primary consideration in screening and filtering applications. For the BOI, it's the activity that the enterprise or the business is involved in. So the enjoyment of income tax holiday will only be insofar as the income that is generated for the specific registered activity. So just please keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. So for pioneer firms, you enjoy income tax holiday for 6 years from commercial operation, 4 years from commercial operation for non-pioneer firms, and 3 years for expanding firms. Next slide, please. So pioneer enterprise, what exactly do we mean by a pioneer enterprise? Under Article 17 of the Omnibus Investment Code, it's a long, it gives a long definition of the same. But what I want to emphasize here is if we try to recall the mission of Board of Investments, which is to develop globally competitive industries and generate local and foreign investments, we can see here that it really emphasizes or tries to emphasize and put a premium on that objective. Like for example, here engaged in the manufacture, processing, or production, and not merely in the assembly or packaging of goods, products, or design, formula, scheme, method, process, or system of production or transformation of any element, substance, or raw materials into another raw material or finished goods, which is new and untried in the Philippines, or engage in the pursuit of agricultural, forestry, and mining activities and or services for self-sufficiency. So if we really look at these the definition under the Omnibus Investment Code, it really puts emphasis on that objective, which is to develop competitive industries here in the Philippines and to generate local and foreign investments that will create more employment opportunities through those investments. Next slide, please. Another incentive is what we call the income tax holiday bonus. So aside from the 6 years, 4 years, and 3 years, you can apply for an extension of the income tax holiday for an extra year for each of the following cases. So if you get to comply with the following conditions: ratio of total imported and domestic capital equipment to the number of workers for the project does not exceed 2,000 US dollars to one worker. Average cost of indigenous raw materials used in the manufacture of the registered products is at least 50% of the total cost of raw materials for the preceding years prior to the extension, and net foreign exchange savings or earnings amount to at least 500,000 annually during the first 3 years of operation. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are just a rundown of the other incentives that you may avail of once you register with the BOI. A special tax rate of 5% on gross income. Now, this one you get to avail of and enjoy after the expiration of the period allowed by the BOI for you to claim a tax holiday. So, for example, after the 6 years, if you are a pioneer enterprise, considered a pioneer enterprise, after the 6 years, this will be your applicable tax rate, the special tax rate of 5% on your gross income. Another incentive that you can avail of is the additional deduction for labor expense, but this one you can not avail of simultaneously with the income tax holiday. Basically, the additional deduction for labor expenses is those wages for laborers that are directly involved in the performance of that registered activity. You can deduct from your income by an additional of 50%. And then for importation of capital equipment, spare parts, and supplies, you are free from import duties and taxes. For those capital equipment, spare parts, and supplies that are directly related to the or necessary to the activity registered, and then we have wharfage use and export tax, duty, imposts, and fees for again for the products that are related to the registered activity. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, when you register with the BOI, it's very specific. Later on, I will be flashing and discussing the priority plan, incentives priority plan, which will be the main basis for registering with the BOI. But just very quickly, I just want to show to you what doing business is as contemplated under the Omnibus Investment Code. So doing business shall be any act or combination of soliciting orders, purchases, sales, or service contracts, appointing a representative or distributor domiciled in the Philippines, or an alien who entered the Philippines as a non-immigrant solely or principally to act as representative or distributor, but must be staying in the Philippines. Opening offices, whether called liaison offices, agencies, or branches. Establishing a factory, workshop, or processing plant. Next slide, please. Undertaking building construction or erection projects. Opening a store, whether wholesale or retail. Maintaining or operating a warehouse for business purposes, including storage, display, or delivery of the products. Participating in the management, supervision, or control of any domestic business, firm, entity, or corporation in the Philippines. However, I must note that for this particular act, the mere investment to a domestic corporation will not be considered as doing business. Next slide, please. Lastly, any other act or acts which imply a continuity of commercial dealings or arrangements and contemplate to that extent the performance of acts or works or the exercise of some of the functions normally incident to or in the progressive prosecution of commercial gain or of the purpose and object of the business organization. So it's this is the catch-all phrase. If, if I can highlight just it's really the most important consideration is the continuity of commercial dealings or arrangements, and not merely an isolated act that we must note and emphasize. Again, if we go back to the mission and objective of the Board of Investments, it's the development of globally competitive industries, which is why they want the continuity of commercial dealings or arrangements here in the Philippines. Next slide are acts that are not considered as doing business. So the following acts by themselves are not considered doing business in the Philippines. The mere publication of a general advertisement through newspapers, brochures, or other publication media, even through radio or television. Maintaining a stock of goods in the Philippines solely for the purpose of having the same processed by another entity. The mere collection of information in the Philippines and performing services auxiliary to an existing isolated contract of sale, which are not on a continuing basis. So again, it's really more of the continuity of doing business here in the Philippines that is the objective. Next slide, please. So investment priority plan. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is the main basis in trying to register. Well, according to Article 27 of the Omnibus Investment Code, the investment priority plan should be released not later than the end of March of every year by the Board of Investments. However, the latest investment priority plan was issued sometime in November 2020 through Memorandum Order number 50. But before this, if I'm not mistaken, the investment priority plan was issued sometime in 2017. So although the law states that it should be issued every year, the president has the discretion of extending that deadline, which is, and it's also understandable since if we look at the progression of the different issuances in terms of the investment priority plan, like the 2017, and the main basis for registering with the BOI is the investment priority plan, and it's supposedly it's supposed to be issued every year. But what you just have to remember is to make sure that you look at the latest investment priority plan that was issued and check whether the activity that you wish to register with the BOI are those that are contemplated and listed under the investment priority plan. So,
Yep.
so we go through each activity. So again, if I'm not mistaken, the only additional activity that was inserted goods and services that relate to the fight against COVID. So some of which, of course, are the essential goods is the production or manufacture of medicines, medical equipment and devices, personal protective equipment, surgical equipment and supplies, and all of those medical medical supplies. Essential services covers services that uh, services such as but not limited to crematorium, health waste treatment and disposal laboratories, test facilities, hospitals, and quarantine facilities. So those are just the new and recent activities that were adopted in the 2020 priorities plan that we of course do not find in the 2017 priorities plan. Um, and then we go now to qualified manufacturing activities. For qualified manufacturing activities, including agro processing, sorry, can we go back to the earlier slide here? Okay. Um, the qualification here is you have to qualify as a manufacturing company, the same. And for agriculture, fishery, and forestry, main consideration here that we have to take note of, well, this covers the commercial production of agricultural, fishery, and forestry products. But for Metro Manila, only agricultural infrastructure and support services and urban agricultural projects may qualify for registration as new expansion or modernization. For strategic services, integrated circuit design covers all logic and design techniques required to design integrated circuits. Creative industries or knowledge-based services covers IT, BPM services for domestic market, samples of which are contact centers, data analytics, and all of those similar industries. Those that involve original content, such as animation, software development, and all of those um, original game development and engineering designs. Maintenance, repair, and overhaul of aircraft, I think, is pretty straightforward. Charging, refueling stations for alternative energy vehicles, except LPG run vehicles. And then industrial waste treatment covers the establishment of treatment facilities for toxic and hazardous waste from industrial operations. Agriculture, fishery, and forestry, what we have to remember is it covers commercial production of agricultural, fishery, and forestry products, which covers nurseries, hatcheries, post-harvest facilities, and other support services and infrastructures. But for Metro Manila, only agricultural infrastructure and support services and urban agricultural projects may qualify for registration. For strategic services, for integrated circuit design, this covers all logic and circuit design techniques required to design integrated circuits. For creative industries and knowledge-based services, covers IT, BPM services for the domestic market, sample of which would be contact centers and data analytics, and those that involve original content, such as animation, software development, game development, and other engineering design. This also covers digital or technological startups or activities. For maintenance, repair, and overhaul of aircraft, well this is pretty straightforward. For charging, refueling stations for alternative energy vehicles, this covers establishment of charging or refueling stations, except LPG run vehicles. For industrial waste treatment, this covers the establishment of treatment facilities for toxic and hazardous waste from an industrial operation. For telecommunications, only new players may qualify for registration. And then for state-of-the-art engineering, procurement, and construction, this covers engineering design, procurement, and construction for industrial plants and infrastructure. Next slide. For healthcare and disaster risk reduction management services, which covers the establishment and operation of general and specialty hospitals and other medical or healthcare facilities, including drug rehabilitation, quarantine, and evacuation centers. For mass housing, this covers the development of mass housing units based on a price ceiling of 2 million and covers in-city low-cost dwelling projects for lease or rent. For Metro Manila, only in-city low-cost dwelling for lease or rent may qualify for registration. Infrastructure and logistics, including local government units and private public partnerships, this covers the establishment and operation of physical infrastructures vital to the country's economic development and prosperity, such as airports, seaports, transport, LNG storage, and regasification facilities, pipeline projects, and all of those that are vital to economic development and prosperity. Innovation drivers covers research and development activities, the conduct of clinical trials, including drug trials, establishment of centers of excellence, innovation centers, business incubation hubs, smart cities, and co-working spaces, development of mobility solutions, and digital trade. This also covers commercialization of new and emerging technologies, uncommercialized patents on products and services and products of locally undertaken research and development. Um, some examples of those are agricultural biotechnology tools disaster mitigation and prevention hardware or software, all of those um, products. For inclusive business models, what's important to consider here is the um, effects on agribusiness and tourism sectors that provide business opportunities to micro and small enterprises. Then for environment or climate change related projects, this covers manufacture or assembly of goods and the establishment of energy efficiency related facilities. For energy, this covers power generation projects utilizing conventional fuels such as coal, diesel, bunker, and natural gas, waste heat and other waste, and establishment of battery energy storage systems. Um, Next slide, please. For export activities, this is for the production and manufacture of export products, export services, and activities in support of exporters. And then we have those special laws such as the industrial tree plantation, mining, publication or printing of books or textbooks, refining, storage, marketing, and distribution of petroleum products. So all of those activities are those that are contemplated under the law as qualifying activities for you to be able to register with the BOI. So it, it, it can be possible that an enterprise will be involved in different activities, and it's allowed to register as many activities as long as you are qualified um, to register for those specific activities under the investment priority plan. So again, the enjoyment of the incentives is specific to the activity registered. So incentives enjoyed will only be in relation to income generated from the registered activities. Next slide, please. I think I discussed this already. So basic requirements, basic documentary requirements when you wish to register with the BOI, a cover letter, accomplished, signed, and duly notarized application form, a Google Map image of proposed and existing projects, business model, financial projections for at least 5 years, audited financial statements, registration documents with the registering agency, and other requirements or endorsements. What you have to remember here is this is just the minimum documentary requirements that will be um, asked of you if you wish to register with the Board of Investments. They may require other supporting documents uh, that will depend on the type of the activity that you are registering for. Um, okay. So the filing date, I just had to put this here because this will be relevant in the processing of your registration. The filing date of application shall be the date of official acceptance. It's when your application is officially registered in the book of registration of BOI, and then there from that point you count 20 working days, wherein if your application is not acted upon, it's considered to be it's considered to be approved already. I think there's a question that was typed, but if it's okay, we'll just address the questions later on in
Yes,
the
let's proceed with everything first, and then we can
question
do the questions one by one.
later on. But
Mhm.
thank you, Joanne, for raising that question. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so for the registration process, it's basically as earlier shown, you submit a complete list of the documentary requirements, and then they check whether the same is complete, and they give it back to you. If I'm not mistaken, they should be able to give it back to you within 48 hours if it's considered incomplete. Otherwise, they will officially recorded in the book of registration of the Board of Investments, and from that point count the 20-day period as required by law. From that point, there will be an official evaluation. It will be referred to the specific expert department that deals with the specific activity you wish to register, and then the issuance of the certificate of registration if the same is approved. What you have to keep in mind in there is what we call um, the requirements for the issuance of the certificate of registration, because aside from your activity being approved registration, they will issue you a certificate of registration that includes certain terms and conditions that the company should accept if ever they get approved for the registration. So there are certain conditions that are required by the Board of Investments depending on the type of the activity, in light of their objective of maximizing investments here in the Philippines, and creating as much employment opportunities. So there are certain conditions attached with your certificate of registration that you must comply with, um, and show compliance. Otherwise, the incentive that you are enjoying by virtue of your registration will be removed. So those are just the points that you must remember. It's not only the registration is just step one of the whole process. You There is a continuing need to comply with the conditions of your registration for you to be able to enjoy the different incentives. Um, and so that's it for BOI. At this point, I cede the floor to my colleague, Attorney Danny, for the discussion on PEZA. Thank you, everyone.
All right, Attorney Danny, please feel free to shed some light on the process.
Yes, thank you for the discussion on the BOI, Attorney John, and thank you for that brief introduction also, Patricia. So now we move ahead to the incentives and other qualifications under the Philippine Economic Zone Authority, or those that are granted by the PEZA. Next slide, please. Okay, so briefly, let me show you what we'll be discussing. So first, we'll be discussing what is PEZA. So what is this entity that's under the DTI, and also the other services that are provided by PEZA aside from application for registration under their entity. What are the qualifications if you do want to register, and what are the incentives that you will be entitled to, and as well as a brief overview of the registration process and other matters that you may wish to consider if you are going to register with them, or if you are thinking of registering your business entity under the PEZA. I see actually from the questions that we have, I think we will be able to address some of those in passing during this discussion, and I think some of them have already been addressed by Attorney John. If not, we'll collectively address them again later on during the Q&A portion. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the Philippine Economic Zone Authority? So the PEZA is also an attached agency under the DTI, or the Department of Trade and Industry, with the mandate to establish a legal framework for integration or coordination and planning of special economic zones, particularly those that are targeted for industrial estates or export processing zones. So mainly, this entity was established to attract foreign investors into the Philippines and to establish these economic zones or special economic zones in specific industries such as in finance, in manufacturing, in agro-industrial, commercial enterprises, and more recently in information technology enterprises. Next slide, please. Okay, so briefly, what are the other services that are offered by PEZA aside from application for the registration under their entity. So once you've already registered your business with them, you may or may not need to amend your registration agreement. So what is the registration agreement and the supplemental agreement? So these are the contracts that you are required to sign with PEZA. Once they've approved your registration, you will be issued the certificate of registration and you will be required to sign the registration agreement, under which there are conditions for compliance. So if you want to amend the terms there, or you want to renegotiate with PEZA regarding the terms there, then you can apply for an amendment. And if you want to request for an additional copy, you can request for a certified true copy of the document with PEZA. And along with those, some of the other services provided by PEZA is also for the amendment of the certificate of registration. So the amendment basically is if you want to include additional registered activities under PEZA. So if, for example, you applied, you want to expand the business activities that you want to be able to be entitled for the incentives, that is the service that you will apply for. And then next slide, please. There's also the application for the letters of authority. So what is the letter of authority? Mainly, this is what you apply with PEZA for if you want to request them for permission to move your assets. That's one. For transfer of your operations, to sell some of your business's assets, or to cancel your registration entirely. So brief note for those of you who are considering to register with PEZA, once your entity has been registered with them, you are required to request with them first the issuance of a letter of authority before you can practically do anything with any assets in your business, because they are now a regulating body under which your business needs to get consent first. Okay, so that's something that you may want to keep in mind. And then there's also the confirmation or validation of the entitlement to the ITH. So this is primarily the certificate of entitlement to the income tax holiday. You will need this document to be presented to the BIR, or the Bureau of Internal Revenue, once you're already going to file your annual tax returns, just to support the claim that you are entitled to the income tax holidays. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll go through some of the incentives that are entitled to each type of enterprise. So Attorney John earlier mentioned that with the BOI, the incentives are granted primarily on the basis of the registered activities. With PEZA, it's correct. It's based primarily on the location where the activities are found. So those are called the eco zones, or the enterprises that are found inside the eco zones. Although recently, like I mentioned, there has been some expansion on the registration. So we call them the registered activities under PEZA. More significant, I think, would be the activities under information technology, or the BPOs. So let's try to go through some of these enterprises one by one and what incentives will be entitled to each of them. Next, please. So the Economic Zone Export Manufacturing Enterprise. So this is one of the first and most common enterprises that were first registered with PEZA. So it's for the manufacturing, processing, or assembly of raw goods or raw materials that will result in products, 70% of which should be exported by the registered entity. So if you do think that your entity will fall under this type of enterprise, then you'll be entitled to the income tax holiday of 4 years, between 4 to 6 years, depending on whether your project is a pioneer or a non-pioneer project. And you may be entitled to an extension of the income tax holiday upon application, but the extension will not exceed the entitlement to 8 years. So it's a maximum of 8 years only. And after the expiration of the income tax holiday period, then you're also entitled to the 5% special tax rate on your gross income in lieu of all national taxes. And then you're also entitled to tax and duty-free importation of equipment and materials or spare parts for the export manufacturing, exemption from wharfage dues on import shipments of equipment, VAT zero rating of local purchases of goods and services, and also exemption from expanded withholding tax. I'd like you to take note of these incentives under this enterprise, because these are some of the most common that are also, if not repeated, some of these are also applicable to some of the enterprises that I'll mention later on. Next slide, please. So for information technology enterprises, or IT enterprises, so these are service activities where at least 70% of the total revenue of the enterprise should be derived from clients abroad. So we can see here just from the first two enterprises, the mandate of PEZA, that it is really targeting revenue derived from foreign investors or foreign clients. So what are these IT service activities? It includes services by BPOs, call centers, data encoding, software development and application enterprises, programming and adaptation of software systems, e-commerce, education, and entertainment. So the income tax holiday granted is also the same. It's between 4 to 6 years, depending on whether you're a pioneer or a non-pioneer project. And then the same period for the income tax holiday extension also applies. 5% special tax on gross income in lieu of national taxes, a tax and duty-free importation on equipment and spare parts, exemption from wharfage dues on import shipments of equipment, again, VAT zero rating of local purchases of goods and services, and exemption from expanded withholding tax. And the next would be the Tourism Economic Zone Locator Enterprise. So this is focused for the establishment and operation within the PEZA economic zone of sports and recreation centers, or attraction activities, special interest attraction activities, again, targeted to foreign tourists as the primary client. So the tax incentives here are, again, limited to 4 years income tax holiday, and then the 5% special tax rate after the expiration of the income tax holiday. And then also tax and duty-free importation, VAT zero rating on local purchases, and exemption from expanded withholding taxes. Next, we have the medical tourism enterprise. So these are medical health services endorsed by the Department of Health, with the primary patients being foreign nationals or foreign patients. So again, you see here the income tax holiday is limited to 4 years on the income derived from servicing foreign patients. And then the applicable 5% special tax rate, and then duty and free importation on medical equipment, including the spare parts that are used for these services, and then VAT zero rating, and then exemption from expanded withholding taxes. Next, please. So with agro-industrial economic zone enterprises, these are divided into two subcategories. So first is the export manufacturing agro-industrial and the biofuel manufacturing. The export manufacturing agro-industrial economic zones are for processing or manufacturing agricultural products with the end goal of exporting those products. For biofuel manufacturing, this is actually fairly recent. So the target is for the agro-industrial enterprises to process or produce and manufacture the crops, and later the end product would be clean energy or alternative sources of energy, such as biofuels. And again, we see here the income tax holiday applicable is just for 4 years, and then again, the special rate is applicable 5% on gross income, tax and duty-free importation on the applicable equipment used for the processing, VAT zero rating of local purchases, and exception from local government fees. Next, please. And then we have economic zone logistics service enterprises. So this is for the operation of warehouse facilities or storage, deposit, safekeeping, importation of local sourcing of raw materials. Here, the incentives are limited to exemptions from duties and taxes on raw materials, semi-furnished goods, and also to VAT zero rating of the raw materials that are used for the packaging or the inspection or checking of the items. Next, please. And then for economic zone developers or operators, so who are these developers and operators? These are the ones who develop or operate and maintain the eco zones that we enumerated above, including retirement economic zone park or centers that are accredited by the Philippine Retirement Authority. So for this type of enterprise or developer, the applicable incentives are only the 5% special tax rate and VAT zero rating, and also exemption from withholding taxes. Okay, so for facilities enterprises, these are for construction or operation of facilities for eco zones, for the eco zones that we enumerated, and including the IT parks or information technology parks or enterprises, and the operation of the retirement facilities. And again, these are the only incentives that are granted. Next, please. For economic zone utilities enterprises, what are the utilities enterprises? So these are the providers of the light and power systems or electricity and water supply distribution systems within or inside the special economic zones. Next, please. So some of the non-fiscal incentives for these types of enterprises are simplified importation and exportation procedures. So if you're not familiar with the import and export procedure here, there are some different agencies that you will have to go through if you want to import and export your products if you're not a registered enterprise here. Also, there are non-resident foreign nationals who can be employed as a technical or supervisory employee. And then for immigration purposes, so like I mentioned earlier, the goal of PEZA really is to attract foreign investors. So they have made it easier for non-resident foreign nationals to move to the Philippines to provide their services. So they have given these incentives for special non-immigrant visas for the foreign national, as well as their spouses and their unmarried children below the age of 21. Next, please. Okay, so what are some of the basic requirements if you do want to apply with PEZA? So the accomplished application form, of course, and then I have to highlight here the project brief and the feasibility study. You have to put there in detail the projected plan for the project that you want to apply. For example, if you're going to register an agro-industrial estate, then you have to include there the development plan within the first 10 years from the grant of the application. So that starts from you're going to build the foundation up to when the vertical developments will be put up, when you will have the locators, and then when you plan to start the operations with those locators. All of that needs to be put in the project brief, as well as the projected income stream. And then again, I also have to emphasize that these requirements are only the initial documents, because there are different requirements that may apply depending on the type of enterprise that you want to register. So beginning from the application form, there's already a difference between an application form for an agro-industrial estate and for an export manufacturing enterprise. Next, please. Okay, so for the registration process flowchart, from the time of the completion of your documents, you will have to go through a pre-screening first with the officer of the ERD, which is the department that accepts the application and processes the application for the board's approval. Once they've evaluated your application to be complete, substantially complete, then your application will be submitted for the board for their discussion. You also have to take note that the PEZA board has a twice-a-month meeting. So if you do want to catch that meeting date, it's best that you submit the documents at least 3 days before the scheduled meeting date. But you don't have to worry about knowing when those meetings will be, because that's something that you can coordinate with with the registration department or the enterprise regulations department. So from the time of submission of your documents up to the board approval, there may be a turnaround period with PEZA of 20 business days before the certificate of registration is issued to you. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we move ahead to the other matters for consideration that you may also want to know. So I've outlined here some fiscal concerns that we have encountered with some clients regarding availing them once they have registered with PEZA. So it might be good for you to know them as well before you do go ahead and register your enterprise. Next, please. So for deductibility of direct costs, so under the Revenue Regulation 11-2005 of the Bureau of Internal Revenue, it states here that there's a specific enumeration for deductible direct costs that's applicable only for Ecozone export enterprises and Ecozone developers, operators, facilities, utilities, and tourism enterprises. If you would notice that under this revenue regulation, it doesn't include service enterprises at all. But through the years, the BIR and actually the Court of Tax Appeals and the Supreme Court have determined little by little that this enumeration under Revenue Regulation 11-2005 does not need to be strictly applied. So in 2013, the BIR ruled that the enumeration is strictly exclusive. They issued that in 2 rulings. And then in 2016 and in 2018, the Court of Tax Appeals, they highlighted that the criteria here that's enumerated here for determining direct costs is or should be its direct relation to the PEZA registered activity or PEZA registered services. In 2018, the court categorically stated that the list of direct costs is not meant to be all inclusive, or this is not meant to be an exclusive list. And then in 2018, the VIR reversed itself and it adapted the ruling of the Court of Tax Appeals and stated that the revenue regulation here prescribes deductible costs for manufacturing enterprises only. But it recognized that there are no service enterprises. There are also service enterprises registered, but these are not mentioned here. So they concluded that direct costs and expenses incurred in connection with the performance of services provided by these types of PEZA registered enterprises should also be equally deductible in the same manner that raw materials and supplies issued or used in production by manufacturing enterprises should also be deductible expenses. And finally, last year in November 2020, the Supreme Court finally ruled on the matter and stated that the enumeration of these deductible direct costs should not be taken as all-inclusive or it is not exclusive, and that the primary consideration for whether the costs should be deductible as direct costs or whether these are incurred from the performance of the PEZA registered activity. Next, please. Okay, so on taxability of the incidental income. So generally only the income from registered activities is subject to the tax incentives. Under Revenue Regulation 20-2002, the BIR ruled that incidental income from activities that are not covered by the scope of the registration with PEZA are not entitled to the tax incentives and thus are subject to the regular income taxes, which is now 25%. And then for taxability of sales by registered enterprises, again, to reiterate, incentives granted by PEZA shall apply only to registered activities and only during the period of the registration, unless the registration itself is extended or a new application is filed. And then the income realized by the registered enterprise from activities that are not related to the PEZA registered activities or that are not pursuant to the PEZA registered activities, those will be subject to regular income taxes. Next, please. Okay, so taxability of non-PEZA locators that are situated within the eco zone. So under the implementing rules and regulation of PEZA, they highlighted that business enterprises located within the eco zone that are not registered with PEZA or that are not registered enterprises are not entitled to the tax incentives. So there was a board resolution by PEZA earlier that there are enterprises that they permit or that they grant permission to operate within eco zones, okay? But this permit or this clearance to operate within the eco zone does not automatically mean that those enterprises are entitled to the tax incentives that are granted to PEZA registered activities. So what needs to happen is if they do want to avail of those incentives, they need to file a separate application for registration with PEZA under one of the enterprises that we discussed earlier. So again, operation as a locator within the eco zone itself does not entitle the business to the tax incentives under PEZA. You're just allowed by PEZA to operate there. Next, please. Okay, so imposition of real property taxes. So the exemption only applies if the registered enterprise is granted the 5% special tax regime. If you remember earlier, there are some enterprises that were not entitled to the 5% special tax rate. But I think this consideration is more applicable actually for manufacturing enterprises or exporters, since they're the ones who have real property as part of their capitalization. Okay, so while under the income tax holiday, there's no exemption from real property taxes. But if there are machineries installed and operated in the eco zone for manufacturing, processing, or for industrial purposes, these shall also not be subject to real property taxes, but only for the first 3 years of the operation. Okay, only for the first 3 years. And other equipment, production equipment that is not attached to the property or the real estate shall be exempt completely from real estate taxes or real property taxes. Next, please. Okay, so for the tax treatment of local sales in excess of 30%, where did the 30% come from, first of all? So under the first few enterprises we discussed, there was the figure of 70% mentioned, that at least 70% of the products that are made by the enterprise should be exported, or at least 70% of the revenue generated should have come from foreign sources, foreign investors or foreign patients, etc. So that the difference of 30% comes from that. There's a threshold or a limit of 30% on locally generated sales. So if the sales or the local sales does not exceed 30%, the enterprise will still be entitled to the income tax holiday and the 5% special rate on gross income. But if the local sales exceeds 30%, then the excess of those sales will be subject to the regular corporate income taxes that used to be 30%, which is now 25%. And then sales to other entities. So if the sales is made to other EcoZone registered entities, then the VAT treatment would be 0% or it would be VAT exempt. And then sales to customs territories, which is a territory that's outside of the EcoZone, there would be a 12% VAT imposed. Next, please. Okay, lastly, I think this is relevant given the current situation we're in. If you would recall, back in March 2020, the lockdown happened almost immediately, and there were only a few days given to business or enterprise owners to clean up or at least manage their operations before they would completely close. So insofar as PEZA registered enterprises, the PEZA issued a memorandum circular allowing Ecozone IT enterprises, so information technology enterprises, to implement work from home strategies immediately, okay, without the need of securing a letter of authority first. If you recall, I also mentioned earlier that if you are registered with PEZA, the moment that you register with them, you are required to secure first a letter of authority before you can move your assets, your operations, or anything basically. So under this circular, they waived the requirement of the letter of authority before removing some of the assets. I think this refers primarily to the laptop equipment so that the employees can continue providing the services under the IT enterprises, because most of these are the BPOs and the call centers. And then recently, PEZA required that during the lockdown, so this is a transition requirement, that during the lockdown, even though you have been allowed to remove your assets from the location, or yes, the business location, you are later required to notify PEZA on which assets you removed from the location of your offices and to which employees they were, or which employees brought them home for purposes of business continuity or availing of the work from home provision. So under the recent circular here, 2021-051, the notification requirement was extended until, actually it already expired until September 30 only. But then again, because of the prolonged lockdowns, PEZA is also continuing to adapt to the issuances of the president of extending the lockdown. So if you would see in the next slide, please. Okay, so there was a resolution by the FIRB, which is the Fiscal Incentive Review Board, on the work from home arrangement. So this was a joint discussion between them and PEZA. They agreed that the work from home arrangement can only allow 90% of the employees of the enterprise, and that at least 10% would have to report back to the offices as skeletal force. They extended this until March 31, 2022. So that also necessarily means, well, from my interpretation, it would also mean that you would have until the same period to notify PEZA of the assets that you have removed from the location and allow the employees to bring home for purposes of work from home operations. But there's a caveat here. You see that beginning January, beginning January 1 of next year, the number of employees allowed to work from home will be reduced to 75% unless the president extends the declaration of the state of calamity beyond January 1, in which case they will maintain the 90% threshold. Next, please. Okay, so to briefly summarize, we've provided here a quick index table of the fiscal incentives that are granted by both PEZA and the BOI. So take note again that these are the collective incentives or the general incentives that are granted by both, and that some of these may not be applicable to some enterprises. As we discussed earlier, these are dependent on whichever activity or enterprise you will be applying for registration based on the qualifications of your business.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay.
All right.
So that's it from my end. I think we can go back to Patricia for the Q&A.
So we actually have a lot of questions, and it's it's actually very good because we also have the business development manager from Carpo Law and Associates to explain us about the services that you guys offer. Since we are seeing a lot of questions, our audience is very curious about this. Yeah, Karim Kizler, please let us know a little more about your services.
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks, participants. I hope that you gathered a lot of information tonight. Carpo Law is our trusted and strategic law firm. So as Kittelsen and Carpo, we are an in-corp company, and we offer corporate solutions to our clients in the Southeast Asia region. And you can see these in these countries, we have offices, and we also provide our clients global assistance through our partners. So we basically help local and foreign clients to incorporate here in the Philippines. We provide corporate housekeeping services, product registration, tax-intensive services, accounting, payroll, immigration, and payroll services. So for tonight's webinar, we have prepared a promo for the participants. So for incorporation, you can avail 20% of discount plus on annual corporate housekeeping, a 10% discount during the first year. You can just basically use this promo code, and it's valid October 27 to December 10. For visa services, we can offer 10%. This would be for 9G visa, work visa for the Philippines, and 47A2 visa. Again, you can just use this promo code, and the validity period is again October 27 to December 10. And for business permit renewal, we offer 20% discount, and our offer is valid till the end of December 2021. Thanks again, and let's jump into the questions. I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions now.
Yeah, actually, we actually have a lot of questions, but not a lot of time. So, Karim, like, how just in case they have questions that we won't be able to answer tonight, because there's a lot and we're running out of time, how can they reach you?
Actually, Attorney John's and Attorney Danny's emails are here. And the presentation will be also shared with the audience, right, Patricia?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
So they can basically, our audience can basically email our attorneys and ask questions regarding the webinar tonight.
Okay. So before we go, maybe Attorney Danny and Attorney John, you could pick one question from all of these questions and maybe just try to answer them. Let's start with Attorney Danny.
Yes, thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Karim. Actually, I was browsing through the questions, and I think some of them we can address collectively. I believe there was a question here on the qualification for registration. I think it was here from Mr. Jeffrey Lucero. So for the qualified activities to register with the BOI, and why are the PEZA accredited spaces preferred locations by BPOs if they can opt to register with the BOI for the same incentives? Again, you can opt to not register your activity with the PEZA or with the BOI. The main reason I think why BPOs are preferring to register with the PEZA instead of with the BOI would be because of the qualifications. Yes, there are similarities in the tax incentives, but you would have to go back to the qualifications and also the requirements for registering before you can avail of those incentives.
All right. Okay, Attorney John, I think you mentioned one question a while ago that maybe you'd like to go back to that question.
Okay. I'm not so sure what particular question that was, but I can see that a lot of questions here involve the effects of the recently passed Create Law and how it impacts the incentives under the BOI and the PEZA, as we earlier discussed. Unfortunately, the guidelines has yet to be issued by the respective agencies. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Attorney Danny. I don't. But for the BOI, they've yet to release the guidelines that should resolve all of those questions. But just very briefly, you can still avail of your the incentives you are currently enjoying under, for example, if you're registered with the BOI or PEZA, you can still continue to enjoy all of those incentives generally. But if ever you will apply for the incentives under the Create Law, the requirement is for you to surrender your certificate of registration, which will serve as your waiver of your right to enjoy all of those incentives under those previous registrations. So basically, you can't enjoy the incentives provided under Create Law and those under BOI or PEZA simultaneously. But there's no need for you. You can continue to enjoy the incentives you are currently enjoying under those registrations. And then later on, once you've exhausted the period for which you're allowed to enjoy the incentives for those specific agencies where you are currently registered, you can apply for the incentives under Create Law if you qualify for it, with the requirement that you surrender your certificate of registration with the BOI or PEZA. And another question that I saw is if you can avail of the incentives under both BOI and PEZA. I think theoretically you can. There's no categorical prohibition to it, but the practicality of it is what you might want to consider. Like, for example, if you're already enjoying a tax holiday under PEZA, and then you're going to register for BOI for the exact same incentive, it might just defeat the purpose, and you add to that, you have to comply with the different conditions of that agency for you to be able to enjoy the incentive. So theoretically, there's no categorical prohibition against it, but practicality, in terms of practical application of it, I don't think it would be advisable.
All right.
Okay. I also noted a question here regarding the VAT zero rating of local purchases from PEZA enterprises. If this is still ongoing, I think this is fairly recent because of the issuance released by the BIR on imposition of the 12% VAT. So we're also monitoring the progress on this because there has been an appeal to suspend the implementation of the 12% VAT on local purchases, which is still supposed to be still zero rated. So I think there was already a suspension on the implementation of this, but we're continuously monitoring it because we don't know if it will, how long the suspension will be, or if the BIR might decide and go ahead to implement the 12% VAT on local purchases.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Kareem, Attorney Danny, and Attorney John, for this very fruitful session. We really learned a lot. And guys, those of you who are watching, please note their contact details in case you're interested about their services, Carpo Law and Associates. Yeah, for about Payoneer services, please visit our blog, or you can just see our website to know more about the services that we offer, just in case you're not a customer yet. So that it's really been a good day. Thank you, everyone.